Across Canada, the sound of a single gunshot has the power to shake an entire community. In a country often seen as peaceful, safe, and insulated from the chaos of the world, mass shootings are not supposed to happen. But when they do, they leave scars that stretch far beyond the crime scenes. From Montreal to Toronto, from Quebec City to the quiet towns of Nova Scotia, every attack has triggered the same haunting question: how could this happen here? Police officers, many of them first on scene, have spoken about the overwhelming silence that follows the chaos. Paramedics recall moments they can't erase. Government officials step before microphones promising answers, reforms, and change. And the public, shaken again and again, gathers in vigils, holds up candles, and searches for meaning in tragedies that defy explanation. Before we begin, let us know in the comments: do you believe Canada is becoming less safe? Or are these rare events simply more visible than ever? And if you care about long-form, fact-driven true crime documentaries like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. École Polytechnique Massacre, 1989. Montreal, December 6, 1989. Just after 5:10 p.m., students inside the engineering building at École Polytechnique heard a sudden burst of gunfire. What began as the sound of a single shot rapidly escalated into chaos. Desks toppled, books scattered, and students ran in every direction. One survivor later said, "We didn't know where to run." Hallways that moments earlier were filled with normal end-of-day chatter now echoed with screams and hurried footsteps as people fled the building. Outside, Montreal police raced through heavy evening traffic toward the campus. Emergency lines were flooded with calls, and within minutes, radio stations across the city interrupted regular programming. News bulletins reported an active shooter on school grounds, turning a routine winter evening into one of the darkest days in Canadian history. The individual responsible was 25-year-old Marc Lepine, a Montreal resident with a history of isolation. He grew up in a turbulent household marked by instability, later living primarily with his mother. By his mid-20s, he had developed strong resentment toward women, particularly those pursuing careers in fields traditionally dominated by men. In 1987 and 1989, he applied to École Polytechnique but did not meet the academic prerequisites required for admission. Over time, this rejection blended with his growing hostility toward feminism. He expressed these views privately and in written notes, where he blamed feminists for his personal failures and the direction of society. On November 21, 1989, he legally purchased a Ruger Mini 14 rifle from a Montreal-area store and acquired a hunting knife shortly thereafter. According to investigators, there were no clear warning signs in the days leading up to December 6th. He stayed mostly to himself, made no public threats, and left no trail indicating the large-scale attack he was planning. The campus itself was calm that afternoon. Students were finishing their final classes before exams. Snow coated the walkways outside. Nothing suggested that within minutes the school would experience one of the most violent attacks ever recorded in Canada. At approximately 5:10 p.m., Lepine entered a mechanical engineering classroom carrying his rifle. He instructed the men to stand on one side of the room and ordered the women to the other. After separating them, he told the male students to leave immediately. Once they exited, he opened fire on the women. 6 were killed in that room alone. He then moved into the hallway, continuing down the corridor and into adjacent classrooms. Witnesses describe seeing him walk with purpose, targeting women specifically. Some students barricaded themselves in rooms. Others jumped through windows or hid under desks. Lepine eventually reached the cafeteria, where dozens of students had gathered. He fired again, injuring several more people, before heading toward another classroom on the first floor. He entered that room, opened fire, and claimed additional lives. The entire attack lasted roughly 20 minutes. In total, 14 women were killed, and many others wounded, including both women and men who were caught in the line of fire. The victims ranged from 21 to 31 years old, most of them students of engineering disciplines. As police closed in on the building, Lepine moved into an empty classroom. There, he ended the attack by taking his own life. The 14 women who lost their lives were students and staff united by ambition and dedication to fields that, at the time, had only recently begun opening more doors to women. Their names remain central to national remembrance ceremonies and engineering scholarships established in their honor. Montreal reacted immediately with grief and disbelief. Candlelight vigils were held throughout the city, and memorial services took place nationwide. Within days, the tragedy sparked widespread discussions about violence against women, misogynistic attitudes, and broader safety concerns on campuses across Canada. Families of the victims spoke publicly, not only about their grief but also about the larger implications of a crime rooted in gender-based hatred. Their advocacy, alongside survivors and community members, soon grew into a national movement focused on firearms regulation and awareness of violence against women. The school reopened after a period of closure, but the event left a permanent mark on its students, faculty, and the engineering community across the country. Counseling services expanded, and annual memorials became part of the campus's ongoing commitment to honoring the victims. The massacre prompted one of the most substantial shifts in Canadian firearms policy. Public pressure quickly led lawmakers to reconsider the nation's regulatory framework. Within a few years, the federal government passed legislation imposing stricter controls on rifle purchases, mandating background checks, improving storage requirements, and restricting magazine capacities. By 1995, the Federal Firearms Act established a comprehensive licensing and registration system. This legislation required firearm owners to obtain valid licenses and adhere to more rigorous standards regarding acquisition, possession, and storage. The laws particularly addressed semi-automatic rifles, including models similar to the one used in the attack, and added limitations intended to reduce mass casualty incidents. Even decades later, the École Polytechnique tragedy continues to be central in discussions about gun policy in Canada. Survivors, families, and advocacy organizations remain active in shaping national debates, opposing attempts to weaken regulations and pushing for stronger measures where gaps persist. December 6th is now recognized annually as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women in Canada. Across the country, campuses, community groups, and public institutions observe moments of silence, hold memorials, and honor the 14 women whose lives were taken. The tragedy stands as one of the most defining mass shootings in Canadian history, not only for its scale, but for the clear motive behind it, which exposed deep societal issues. It remains a pivotal moment that reshaped national awareness, influenced legislation, and sparked ongoing advocacy aimed at preventing violence rooted in hate and inequality. Though more than 3 decades have passed, the legacy of the École Polytechnique massacre remains embedded in Canadian consciousness, a reminder of the lives lost and a continuing call for vigilance, education, and prevention. Dawson College Shooting, 2006. Montreal, Quebec, September 13, 2006. Just after 12:40 p.m. on a warm Wednesday afternoon, the atrium and cafeteria at Dawson College were packed with students finishing lunch, chatting at tables, and preparing for afternoon classes. Everything changed in seconds. Outside the de Maisonneuve Boulevard entrance, gunfire suddenly erupted. Students standing on the steps broke into a run, sprinting inside as others dropped for cover behind outdoor planters and concrete pillars. The sound echoed through the building almost immediately, sending shockwaves through the atrium as hundreds of students panicked and scrambled to escape. Tables flipped, backpacks were abandoned, and people tried to push through crowded exits while others hid wherever they could. Within minutes, Montreal police officers arrived and entered the building, moving quickly toward the direction of the shots. They confronted the gunman in the atrium, opening fire as he attempted to continue through the corridor. The exchange lasted moments. The gunman was struck, and shortly after, he ended his own life. From the first shot to the final moment, the ordeal lasted roughly 20 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, silence settled over a campus that had been transformed from a normal school environment into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Canadian history. The attacker was 25-year-old Kimveer Singh Gill from Laval. Gill had a long history of isolation and spent significant time on fringe internet forums where he posted disturbing content, including photographs posing with firearms and hostile commentary about society in general. His personal online journal revealed a pattern of despair, resentment, and fixation on violent themes. Years earlier, he had briefly entered military training but left before completing the program. In adulthood, he became involved in a local shooting club and legally obtained several firearms, including a Beretta CX-4 Storm carbine, a handgun, and a shotgun. All were properly registered under Canada's licensing requirements at the time. Security footage later revealed that Gill had visited Dawson College in early August, walking the halls and observing the layout of the building. Investigators concluded that these were deliberate reconnaissance trips made in preparation for his attack. Despite the concerning online material he posted, there had been no police reports, psychiatric evaluations, or formal complaints filed against him. To the licensing system, he appeared as a quiet, law-abiding gun owner. On the morning of September 13th, students arrived for class as they always did. The cafeteria was full by midday, and the campus atmosphere was typical for the start of the fall semester. Nothing suggested an imminent threat. Around 12:41 p.m., Gill parked his gray Pontiac Sunfire near the southwest entrance of the college, stepped out wearing a long black coat, and immediately opened fire on students gathered outside. Several people were struck before they even had time to react. Gill then moved into the atrium, firing randomly as students ran in all directions. Witnesses described him walking steadily, scanning the room while shooting toward groups of people. In the cafeteria, terrified students attempted to protect one another. Some pulled injured classmates under tables to hide. Others guided strangers toward side exits and stairwells. The noise of the gunfire was so loud and disorienting that many students later recalled having no idea where the shots were coming from, only that they had to get out as fast as possible. Police officers arrived quickly, which would later be credited with preventing a much higher casualty count. As they advanced into the atrium, they exchanged gunfire with Gill, hitting him once. Cornered and injured, he ended his own life moments later. By the time the threat was neutralized, dozens of students had been wounded or traumatized, and the campus was placed in full lockdown as emergency crews moved in. One student, 18-year-old Anastasia Rebecca D'Souza, did not survive. She was struck multiple times and was pronounced dead inside the college. Her death deeply affected the college community, as she was known to be well-liked and active in student life. 19 others were injured, some critically. Among them was a visitor who had been on campus that day. He sustained severe head injuries and was placed in a medically induced coma after receiving emergency treatment. As news of the shooting spread, crowds formed outside the police perimeter. Parents rushed to find their children, and vigils began taking shape in the hours that followed. Montrealers gathered in silence near the barricades, and messages of support and sympathy were issued by leaders at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. The college shut down temporarily while counselors, trauma specialists, and crisis response teams were brought in to support students and staff. The investigation that followed was extensive. Police searched Gill's home, his car, and his digital devices. His online presence revealed intense fixation on weapons and rage toward society, as well as references to past school shootings. Forensic teams reconstructed his movements with precision, confirming the timeline from his arrival at the college to the final confrontation with police. His legally registered firearms and valid permits became a major point of scrutiny. The investigation concluded that the attack was premeditated, carefully planned, and carried out without assistance or collaboration from anyone else. In the weeks following the shooting, Dawson College began the long process of recovery. Hundreds of students and staff participated in trauma support programs, and psychological researchers documented the long-term effects of the event on the community. The college eventually created the Peace Garden, a memorial site established to honor Anastasia D'Souza and provide a place for reflection and healing. Nationally, the Dawson College shooting reignited the debate over firearms legislation and the screening process for gun license applicants. Many questioned whether stricter psychological evaluations or improved monitoring of online behavior could have flagged Gill as a risk. Although no single law emerged directly because of the attack, the event influenced later discussions about firearms classification, mental health reporting, and the responsibilities of gun owners. It also reinforced the need for rapid police response and the importance of emergency preparedness in schools and public institutions. For Dawson College, the events of September 13, 2006, remain a defining moment in its history. One young woman lost her life, 19 others were injured, and hundreds more were left with lasting trauma. The shooting exposed gaps in the systems meant to protect the public, highlighted the influence of online communities in shaping harmful ideologies, and underscored how quickly a single individual could inflict widespread harm. Despite the passage of time, the impact of the Dawson College tragedy continues to shape discussions about safety, mental health, and firearms access in Canada. It stands as a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities within modern institutions and of the resilience of communities forced to rebuild in the aftermath of violence. Quebec City Mosque Shooting 2017. Quebec City, January 29, 2017, 7:55 p.m. Inside the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City, evening prayers had just begun. Dozens of worshippers were standing shoulder to shoulder, reciting quietly. Then, without warning, the sound of rapid gunfire cracked through the prayer hall. People dropped instantly. Others scrambled for cover behind pillars, shelves, and walls. Some tried to shield family members lying beside them. Emergency calls flooded 911. Dispatchers received panicked reports of multiple victims, a gunman inside the mosque, and people trapped between rows of prayer mats. Within minutes, Quebec City police officers entered the building, unsure if the shooter was still inside. They moved past injured worshippers, stepping through a scene marked by confusion, fear, and silence, the immediate aftermath of one of the worst mass shootings in modern Canadian history. The man responsible for the attack was 27-year-old Alexandre Bissonnette, a student at Université Laval. Bissonnette lived quietly, had no criminal record, and was described by former classmates as introverted and socially withdrawn. While he had friends at university, he often kept to himself and spent long hours alone online. Court documents later showed that Bissonnette followed extremist political pages and consumed large amounts of online content connected to anti-immigrant rhetoric. He frequently viewed material supportive of far-right political positions and made hateful comments on social media under his personal accounts. These interactions were not reported to law enforcement before the attack, and he was not on any police or intelligence watch lists. In the weeks leading up to January 29th, nothing indicated a direct threat. He continued attending classes, living at home, and maintaining his normal routine, but his internet history later revealed obsessive searches about mass violence, extremist figures, and public debates around immigration. Investigators noted that he spent significant time reading about recent political developments both within Canada and abroad. The political climate at the time included heightened national discussions about immigration, the refugee crisis, and cultural identity. These topics were frequently featured in national media, online forums, and political debates. However, investigators emphasized that Bissonnette acted alone, planning and carrying out the attack independently. At around 7:45 p.m., Bissonnette drove to the Islamic Cultural Center armed with a legally registered handgun. He parked his vehicle, walked directly toward the entrance, and stepped inside during evening prayers. As he entered the prayer hall, he immediately opened fire toward the congregation. Worshippers closest to the doorway were struck first. Some tried to rush toward the children's area to protect younger attendees. Others attempted to shield elderly worshippers. Survivors later described the scene as chaotic and disorienting. People trying to crawl to safety, slipping on the floor as they attempted to reach the side rooms or the back exit. Bissonnette paused only briefly to reload before continuing further inside. Several individuals attempted to distract him or move others out of his line of sight. Their actions allowed some worshippers to escape through a side corridor. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. As police units moved rapidly toward the mosque, Bissonnette fled the scene and drove north across town. At approximately 8:10 p.m., he called 911 from his vehicle. During the call, he identified himself, admitted responsibility, and requested police intervention. Officers located him shortly afterward and took him into custody without resistance. 6 men lost their lives that night. All were respected members of the local Muslim community and represented diverse backgrounds, ages, and professions. They were Ibrahima Berry, 39, Mamadou Tanu Berry, 42, Khaled Belkacemi, 60, Abu Bakr Thabti, 44, Abdel Krim Hassan, 41, Azzedine Soufiane, 57. Many of them were fathers, husbands, workers, and community volunteers. Their deaths deeply affected not only their families, but the entire province. 19 additional people were injured, several of them seriously. Survivors continue to deal with long-term physical and emotional trauma in the years following the attack. In the hours after the shooting, vigils took place across Quebec and in major cities across Canada. Thousands gathered in cold winter temperatures to mourn the victims, offer support to the Muslim community, and condemn the violence. Federal and provincial leaders attended public memorials, with many calling the attack a dark moment in Canadian history. The mosque itself became a focal point of national attention, receiving support from various religious and cultural groups. The tragedy sparked an unprecedented wave of solidarity across the country. Following his arrest, Bissonnette was transported to police headquarters, where he was interviewed for several hours. According to official interrogation records, he admitted to planning the attack and described feeling overwhelmed by fear and paranoia linked to global political events. At several points, he expressed regret, but also described long-standing fixation on violent scenarios he had researched online. Investigators recovered his computer equipment and uncovered thousands of pages of browsing history, including repeated searches related to extremist figures, mass shootings, and detailed information about the Islamic Cultural Center itself. The Crown later argued that Bissonnette's digital footprint demonstrated clear motive rooted in anti-immigrant sentiment and hateful ideology. In 2018, Bissonnette pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. During sentencing, the court reviewed the severity of the attack, the vulnerability of the victims, and the lasting impact on the community. The initial sentence imposed was 40 years before parole eligibility, one of the longest in Canadian history at the time. However, in 2020, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that consecutive parole ineligibility periods of that length were unconstitutional. Bissonnette's sentence was adjusted to 25 years before eligibility, which remains the standard for first-degree murder in Canada. The modification did not reduce the severity of his crimes, but ensured the sentence aligned with constitutional limits regarding parole stacking. Throughout the proceedings, survivors and families gave powerful statements about the night of the attack and how it reshaped their lives. Their testimony played an important role in documenting the long-term consequences of the tragedy. The Quebec City mosque shooting had profound influence on discussions around hate-motivated crimes in Canada. Legislators, legal scholars, and community leaders called for stronger recognition of hate as an aggravating factor in violent offenses. The attack accelerated national conversations about Islamophobia, extremism, and the need for improved tracking of hate incidents. Religious centers across the country, including mosques, synagogues, churches, and temples, reassessed their CQs. Righty measures. Many introduced new safety protocols, surveillance systems, controlled access points, and emergency preparedness training. Governments at municipal, provincial, and federal levels offered grants to help religious institutions strengthen security infrastructure. The shooting also contributed to the creation of the National Day of Remembrance of the Quebec City mosque attack and action against Islamophobia, observed annually on January 29th. It stands as both a memorial to the 6 men who were killed and a national reminder of the dangers of hate-driven violence. The events of January 29, 2017, unfolded in minutes, but changed the lives of countless people forever. 6 men were murdered, 19 others were wounded, and an entire community was left shaken. The tragedy forced Canada to confront hard questions about extremism, hate, and the vulnerabilities of public worship spaces. Though years have passed, the Quebec City mosque shooting remains one of the clearest examples of how a single individual, motivated by hatred and isolation, can inflict devastating harm. The legacy of the victims lives on through national remembrance, strengthened laws, and ongoing efforts to counter hate in all its forms. Danforth Shooting, Toronto, 2018. Toronto, Ontario, July 22, 2018. On a warm summer night just after 10 p.m., Danforth Avenue in Toronto's Greek town was crowded with families, friends, and late-night diners. The sidewalks were full, patios were busy, and the atmosphere was lively. Then, without warning, the sharp sound of gunfire ripped through the street. People ducked behind tables and cars. Others sprinted into restaurants, and shouts of confusion filled the air. Security footage later showed a man walking with an eerie calmness, firing a handgun as he moved west along the sidewalk. Within minutes, police officers sprinted toward the scene. After a brief confrontation nearby, the suspect was found dead with what investigators later described as a fatal self-inflicted gunshot wound. The attack lasted only moments, but it left 2 people dead, 13 injured, and an entire city stunned. The gunman was 29-year-old Faisal Hussein, a resident of Toronto. In the immediate aftermath, his parents issued a statement describing a son who had struggled for years with serious mental health challenges. According to the family, he had been treated by multiple professionals, had long-standing issues with depression and psychosis, and had withdrawn significantly from social connections. Neighbors later recalled a quiet individual who rarely interacted beyond brief greetings. His digital activity suggested exposure to violent and extremist material, but investigators were careful to note that he was not linked to any organized group, nor was he on any watch list. His difficulties, according to both police and his family, appeared rooted in personal mental decline rather than a coordinated ideology. On the evening of July 22nd, Hussein traveled to the Danforth area carrying a .40 caliber Smith Wesson handgun. The weapon was later confirmed to have been illegally sourced. Police would eventually trace its origin to the United States, a detail that reignited long-standing concerns about the cross-border flow of handguns into Canadian cities. At approximately 10 p.m., Hussein began firing near the Alexander the Great Parkette. Witnesses described a rapid series of shots that sent crowds into immediate panic. Some people threw themselves to the ground, others ran into nearby shops, and many attempted to shield children. One witness later told investigators that the gunman briefly spoke to him, saying he would not shoot, a detail that emphasized the unpredictable and indiscriminate nature of the attack. Hussein continued westward along Danforth Avenue, firing at random toward people on the sidewalk and into open storefronts. Several individuals were struck without warning as they walked with friends or sat near windows. Others escaped injury by seconds, running between parked cars or slipping into restaurants as the gunman approached. The violence moved quickly, with no clear pattern beyond targeting whoever happened to be in his path. Police officers arrived within minutes of the first emergency call. They located Hussein nearby, leading to a short exchange of gunfire. The confrontation ended abruptly. When officers closed in moments later, they discovered the suspect with a fatal self-inflicted wound. The active threat was over less than 10 minutes after it began. In the immediate aftermath, paramedics and trauma teams from across the city mobilized. 13 injured victims were transported to various hospitals. Tragically, 18-year-old Reese Fallon and 10-year-old Juliana Kozes did not survive their injuries. Fallon had been celebrating a friend's birthday that night, while Kozes had been out with family. Both deaths deeply affected the city, and their names quickly became central to public tributes and memorials. As news spread, Toronto's largest urban community responded with vigils, flowers, and messages along Danforth Avenue, City leaders called the event a devastating blow to a neighborhood long known for its safety and sense of community. Statements from the mayor, premier, and prime minister offered condolences and support, and thousands attended public gatherings in the days that followed. For many, the shooting challenged the belief that Toronto's streets were insulated from the kind of random mass violence seen elsewhere. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the attackers' movements, motivations, and weapon source. Forensic teams reviewed security footage, frame by frame, mapping the exact route Hussein took along the street. Ballistic analysts examined shell casings and bullet trajectories, confirming that a single handgun had been used throughout the attack. The firearm investigation quickly shifted toward how Hussein obtained the weapon. Evidence showed it had originally been legally purchased in the United States before being brought illegally into Canada, a finding that highlighted the long-standing issue of cross-border gun trafficking. Detectives also conducted an exhaustive review of Hussein's digital activity. They recovered browsing histories, online profiles, and messages, identifying repeated visits to violent content and extremist-leaning pages. However, authorities stressed that no credible evidence linked him to any terrorist organization or co-conspirator. The picture that emerged was of a deeply troubled individual acting alone. A precise motive could not be established, despite months of analysis. The city's reaction included both grief and renewed policy discussion. The shooting intensified debate about illegal firearms circulating in large urban centers and whether Canadian cities should push for tighter handgun restrictions. Toronto officials pointed to the Danforth attack as part of a wider pattern of rising gun violence connected to smuggled weapons. Federal leaders acknowledged the concern, citing the need for stronger tracking measures and cooperation with U.S. agencies. Law enforcement also reviewed emergency response protocols. Police leadership praised the rapid arrival of officers and the coordination between units, emphasizing that quick engagement likely prevented additional casualties. Urban policing experts used the incident as a case study to evaluate patrol density, rapid response strategies, and the advantages of closely monitored entertainment districts. For families and survivors, the aftermath was a long process of recovery. Physical injuries required weeks or months of treatment, and psychological impacts extended far beyond the night of the attack. Community organizations established support programs, trauma counseling became widely available, and neighborhood groups organized annual remembrances to honor the victims. Business owners returned to Danforth Avenue with visible signs of resilience, reopening storefronts, and restoring normalcy in the area even years later. Officials and analysts described the Danforth shooting as an event that exposed several vulnerabilities: gaps in mental health care, challenges in preventing illegal firearms from entering Canada, and the difficulty in predicting violent outbursts from individuals acting alone. While the investigation ultimately concluded that Hussein was solely responsible and acted without assistance, the broader implications led to nationwide discussions about prevention and urban safety. As a chapter in Canadian crime history, the Danforth shooting underscores how quickly violence can erupt in public spaces and how complex the underlying factors often are. 2 lives were taken, 13 people were wounded, and countless others were left with lasting trauma. Toronto responded swiftly, both in emergency action and in community solidarity. The lessons drawn from that night continue to shape conversations about mental health support, illegal firearms, and the responsibilities of urban policing across the country. Fredericton Shooting, 2018. Fredericton, New Brunswick, August 10, 2018. Just after 7:00 a.m. Fredericton police received multiple calls reporting gunfire inside a quiet residential complex on Brookside Drive. Early morning light was still settling over the neighborhood as officers rushed toward the source of the disturbance. Within minutes, constables Rob Costello and Sarah Burns arrived on scene, stepping out of their vehicle and moving toward the courtyard where the shots had been reported. As they approached the area between 2 apartment buildings, a new round of gunfire erupted. Both officers were struck almost immediately. Radio chatter spiked as other units called for backup, medical assistance, and containment of the area. The shooter continued firing from a second-floor window until officers managed to breach the building and take him into custody. In less than an hour, 4 people were dead, including the 2 responding officers. The man arrested was Matthew Vincent Raymond, a 48-year-old resident of the same apartment complex. At the time of the incident, Raymond had been living alone and was known locally as an avid cyclist who kept to himself. Early interviews with neighbors later revealed a pattern of increasingly unusual behavior in the months leading up to the shooting. Some residents described him shouting at people who walked near the complex, expressing bizarre beliefs, or making paranoid remarks. Although people noticed the changes, no formal reports of threats or violence were filed before the morning of the attack. Raymond had previously worked in various jobs around Fredericton, but by 2018 he was unemployed and largely isolated. Court documents later showed that he had grown increasingly withdrawn in the year leading up to the shooting. He spent long periods inside his apartment, and neighbors recalled that he often seemed agitated, especially in the weeks before the incident. Investigators later found written materials, online searches, and notes indicating deteriorating mental stability. Despite these signs, he had not been under any active supervision or treatment at the time. The shooting began around 7 o'clock a.m. when 2 civilians, Bobby Lee Wright, 32, and Donald Donnie Robichaud, 42, were attacked outside near a parking area. The pair had been loading items into a vehicle when Raymond fired from a second-floor window overlooking the courtyard. Witnesses later told investigators they heard what sounded like multiple cracks, followed by shouting. Several residents called 911 as they looked out their windows to see 2 bodies on the ground. When Constables Costello and Burns arrived, they attempted to reach the victims and secure the area. As they approached the courtyard, Raymond fired again from his apartment window. Both officers were hit and collapsed. Their fellow officers, who were still en route, were met with a chaotic scene. Civilians hiding in nearby units, 2 injured officers lying exposed, and an active shooter firing sporadically from above. A perimeter was quickly established. Officers used armored shields and took cover behind vehicles as they assessed the situation. Communication over radio channels remained intense, with officers coordinating positions and preparing for an entry into the building. After several minutes of sporadic gunfire, Raymond paused long enough for officers to move in. They breached the building, located his apartment, and apprehended him without further shots being fired. The suspect was found injured, having been hit by return fire, and was transported to hospital under police supervision. Once the scene was secured, paramedics moved in to treat the wounded. Costello and Burns were pronounced dead at the scene. The 2 civilian victims were also confirmed deceased. The city of Fredericton, still waking up for the day, gradually learned through news alerts and emergency notifications that one of the worst mass shootings in the province's history had unfolded in an otherwise quiet residential area. In the hours and days that followed, grief spread through New Brunswick. The deaths of Constables Costello and Burns, both well known within the Fredericton police force, prompted province-wide mourning. Flags were lowered, and condolences came from across the country. Vigils formed outside police headquarters, and flowers were laid in front of the building as residents sought to honor the fallen officers. The funerals drew first responders from across Canada, forming a long procession of police vehicles, military personnel, and emergency services in a display of solidarity rarely seen in the region. As the community mourned, investigators began the exhaustive task of reconstructing the events of that morning. The RCMP's Major Crime Unit took over the investigation, working alongside Fredericton Police to gather ballistic evidence, witness accounts, digital records, and physical items from the suspect's apartment. One of the central questions was whether the attack was targeted or random. Investigators quickly concluded that the civilian victims were not known to the shooter, nor were the responding officers targeted personally. The shots fired from the apartment window appeared to stem from Raymond's delusional beliefs, as later documented in psychiatric assessments. A pivotal component of the legal proceedings was Raymond's mental state. His defense attorneys argued that he was experiencing severe delusions at the time of the shooting and lacked the capacity to understand his actions. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest supported the existence of significant mental illness, including fixed false beliefs that investigators described as extreme and untreated. Prosecutors countered that despite these issues, the severity of the offense required full accountability under the law. The trial experienced multiple delays due to questions concerning Raymond's fitness to stand trial. In early proceedings, he was found unfit, meaning he could not fully comprehend the legal process. Over months of treatment and evaluation, he eventually improved enough for the case to move forward. During the trial, expert witnesses testified at length about his psychological state, his belief system at the time of the shooting, and the extent to which those factors influenced his behavior. In November 2020, the jury returned a verdict of not criminally responsible, NCR, due to mental disorder. Raymond was ordered to be held at a secure psychiatric facility under the authority of the New Brunswick Review Board. The decision meant he would not serve a traditional prison sentence, but would remain in medical custody indefinitely, subject to periodic evaluations and public safety assessments. The ruling, though legally consistent with psychiatric evidence, was emotionally difficult for many affected families who had hoped for a different outcome. The Fredericton shooting prompted discussions across Canada about police tactics, mental health intervention, and how rapidly officers must adapt when confronting armed individuals in residential environments. Police services examined their training protocols, emphasizing situational awareness and protective positioning when responding to calls involving potential gunfire. The incident also renewed calls for improved systems to identify individuals whose untreated mental illnesses may pose risks to themselves or others. For the community of Fredericton, the tragedy left a lasting impact. 4 people lost their lives, including 2 well-respected police officers, and the city's sense of safety was profoundly shaken. Yet the response from emergency services, from residents, and from law enforcement across the country demonstrated a unified commitment to supporting those affected and understanding how such violence can be prevented in the future. Nova Scotia, mass shooting, 2020. Portapique, Nova Scotia, April 18 to 19, 2020. Late on a quiet Saturday night, residents of Portapique began calling 911 to report flames rising from homes and the sound of gunfire echoing across the rural community. The first calls came just after 10 o'clock p.m. People described explosions, shots in the distance, and a man seen driving a vehicle that looked exactly like an RCMP cruiser. Within minutes, more calls came from surrounding properties, some reporting injured neighbors, others reporting structures fully ablaze. As RCMP officers arrived and tried to move deeper into the community, they saw multiple houses burning and bodies lying outside. At the same time, new 911 calls began coming in from nearby roads, suggesting the gunman had already left the area. Police initially believed they might be searching for an officer in distress because the suspect's car was a nearly perfect replica of an RCMP patrol vehicle. Over the next 13 hours, officers would track the gunman across more than 100 kilometers of rural Nova Scotia until the final confrontation at a gas station in Enfield ended the rampage. The shooter was identified as 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman, a denturist who owned property in Portapique and lived part-time at the scene of the initial attacks. According to the Mass Casualty Commission's findings and earlier RCMP reports, Wortman had experienced years of personal and financial strain. Investigators documented a consistent pattern of violent behavior inside his intimate relationship, including past allegations of assault that were never escalated into formal charges. Several acquaintances told the inquiry that Wortman's behavior had become increasingly volatile in the year before the attacks, with outbursts, paranoia, and fixation on weapons and police equipment. From late night into the early hours of April 19th, Wortman traveled through several rural communities, including Wentworth, Glenholm, and Debert, attacking more victims. Some were targeted in their homes, others were killed while out for morning errands or walks. The randomness of these encounters created major challenges for police, who were still piecing together an evolving map of the suspect's movements. As Sunday morning progressed, more 911 calls began to come from different parts of Colchester County, each reporting new shootings or suspicious sightings of a marked police vehicle. By mid-morning, RCMP confirmed they were dealing with an active shooter traveling across the province in an RCMP-style vehicle, though a detailed public alert had not yet been issued. The inquiry later concluded that delays in public communication contributed to unnecessary risks for residents, many of whom were out on morning routines unaware of the danger. Shortly before 11:30 a.m., Wortman arrived at an Enfield gas station, where an RCMP emergency response team member recognized the suspect's vehicle. A confrontation followed, and Wortman was shot and killed by police officers. The rampage lasted approximately 13 hours, stretched across multiple communities, and left 22 people dead, making it the deadliest mass murder in Canadian history. Among the victims were parents, teachers, nurses, neighbors, retirees, small business owners, and RCMP Constable Heidi Stevenson, who was killed after attempting to stop the gunman's vehicle. Another officer was injured in that same encounter but survived. Many victims were targeted at random, simply for being on the road or at home during the suspect's passage. In the aftermath, grief spread rapidly through Nova Scotia and across Canada. Vigils, memorial ceremonies, and moments of silence were held nationwide. Families of victims, survivors, and first responders described lasting psychological impacts, particularly for those who witnessed the fires, shootings, and destruction left behind. The scale of loss, spread across so many small communities, created a province-wide period of mourning that lasted for months. The investigation that followed was among the most extensive in RCMP history. Teams collected evidence from 17 crime scenes, traced the origin of each firearm, reconstructed ballistic patterns, and analyzed the sequence of fires and shootings across Portapique and neighboring towns. Investigators confirmed that several of Wortman's weapons were illegally smuggled across the U.S. border and that he had a long history of violent behavior that had not resulted in criminal charges or interventions. They also documented the role of the replica RCMP cruiser, which allowed him to move freely without raising suspicion. However, it was the public inquiry, the Mass Casualty Commission, MCC, that provided the most significant findings. Released in 2022 and 2023, the MCC reports highlighted major problems in how information about Wortman's past behavior was handled, how emergency alerts were issued, and how police communication unfolded during the event. The inquiry found that early allegations of domestic violence involving Wortman had not resulted in meaningful follow-up, and that his stockpiling of weapons and imitation police equipment went largely unnoticed by authorities. The MCC also concluded that delays in issuing public warnings on the night of the attack created dangerous conditions for residents who had no idea an active killer was moving through the province. Problems with radio communications, inconsistent information sharing, and limited resources in rural policing were identified as key factors that complicated the response. In the months after the tragedy, the federal government introduced a sweeping ban on over 1,500 models of assault-style firearms. Although the ban was not solely a response to the Nova Scotia attack, officials acknowledged that the incident accelerated political momentum to tighten gun regulations. Provincial and federal agencies also began reviewing emergency alert protocols, ensuring that future threats, whether fires, shootings, or other public dangers, trigger immediate notifications. For law enforcement, the attack prompted updates to active shooter training, especially in rural settings where officers may need to cover large distances with limited support. Police oversight discussions intensified, with calls for clearer transparency during crisis events and stronger accountability for communication decisions made in real time. The Nova Scotia mass shooting remains one of the most significant criminal events in Canadian history, not only for its scale, but for the lessons it forced the country to confront. 22 lives were taken across multiple communities, and countless others were forever altered. The tragedy revealed vulnerabilities in emergency response, gaps in firearm oversight, and the devastating impact of unchecked violence in isolated regions. As the documentary moves forward, This case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly danger can spread when systems fail, and how critical reform becomes after such profound loss. Across all these cases, one thing becomes undeniable. Each tragedy forced Canada to confront the limits of its own sense of safety. For decades, mass shootings were seen as distant events, something that happened elsewhere, not here. But these incidents, spread across provinces, cities, and small rural communities, changed that perception. They showed that violence can emerge in classrooms, places of worship, busy streets, and even quiet neighborhoods where nothing unusual had ever happened before. In every case, the aftermath extended far beyond the initial crime scene. Families lost loved ones. Survivors carried physical and emotional scars. First responders dealt with memories that stayed with them long after the headlines faded. Some communities found strength in unity, building memorials, hosting vigils, and supporting one another through difficult recoveries. Others continue to struggle, still working to understand what happened and how to move forward. Each tragedy also reignited crucial national debates about mental health support, access to firearms, gaps in policing, emergency alert systems, and how Canadian institutions can adapt to prevent future incidents. These discussions remain ongoing, shaped by new research, public inquiries, and the voices of those directly affected. As we close this documentary, it's important to remember that behind every statistic and every news report are real people whose lives were permanently altered. Their stories continue to influence policy, shape public awareness, and remind the country that prevention, preparedness, and compassion are all part of public safety. If you have thoughts on any of these cases, share them respectfully in the comments below. Each perspective adds to an important conversation. And if you'd like more in-depth true crime documentaries like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes.